Hey folks, it's Paul Gomez with Gomez Training International. Today we're going to talk about wound ballistics. Now the classic argument, 9 versus 45. What's that all about? Why does it matter? First things, guys, we have to understand what do we expect, or what are we asking our handguns to do? You have to understand, pistols suck. The only thing pistols do well is remain unseen. They're easy to carry. Last time I walked into the bank with an AK on my back, they got really nervous. It's the only thing pistols do well. They're not very powerful, they're not very reliable, they're not very accurate, they're not very easy to shoot compared to a long gun. But they're what we've got. We can have them with us. Understand, the only way a pistol, or any round, can physically stop the bad guy is to damage the brain or the upper spine. Brain or the upper spine shuts down the bad guy. Minus that, absent that, all we're doing is poking holes. We're trying to poke holes in vital structures to cause bleeding, to reduce the blood pressure, so that the system can no longer maintain. Now, understand that the vast majority of times when someone is shot, they will choose to quit doing what they were doing. But it is a choice. It's a psychological stop. It is not a physiological stop. What that means is they were not physically unable to continue their hostile action. They chose to. They chose to stop. Whether that was a conscious choice or not, it was a psychological stop. Now there's nothing we can do to, increase the likelihood of a psychological stop. That's beyond our control. What can we do? We can direct our rounds as rapidly as we can to put them in the appropriate location to cause the greatest amount of bleed out to get the person to the point, the bad guy to the point they cannot physically continue their action. If they stop prior to that point, wonderful. But when we are called to have a pistol in our hands to shoot another person, we have got to do that in such a way. We've got to take that ammunition and direct it in such a way that we, as rapidly as possible, make them stop doing what they were doing. Okay, 9 versus 45, right? The eternal argument. Understand that with modern ammunition, with modern defensive/duty ammunition, all of it, 9mm, 40 cal, 387 SIG, 45, all of our modern defensive/duty ammunition is designed to perform to the same standards. Now, what are those standards and where do they come from? Those standards, they're sort of two parallel standards depending on who you're looking at or where you're coming into the discussion. But those standards are either the FBI test protocols. The FBI test protocols are an 8-stage test that were first developed around 1989, following the wound ballistics seminars and wound ballistics conferences following the 1986 Miami massacre. If you're not familiar with the event that took place in Miami in April of 1986, do a little bit of research. You'll find a lot of information there. But one of the things that came out of it was the FBI was very underwhelmed with the performance of the ammunition they were issuing at that time. So the FBI test protocol was an 8-stage test. There were 8 events, which involved firing through intermediate barriers, in the most cases, into calibrated gelatin, 10% calibrated ordnance gelatin. And we'll talk about what that standard, what that means in a moment. With the FBI protocol, what they decided upon was a minimum 12-inch penetration in calibrated gelatin, with up to 18 inches of penetration being desirable. Now, calibrated gelatin, calibrated to what? What does that mean? Okay. What that comes from is this, guys. 10% calibrated ordnance gelatin was chosen because it had the same resistance to penetration as swine, pig muscle tissue. Why pig muscle? What's that got to do with anything? Pig muscle historically had been used in wound ballistics testing because pig muscle had the same density as human muscle tissue. Muscle tissue is the hardest part of the body to consistently drive bullets through and get acceptable performance out of it. So swine muscle or swine muscle tissue was used because it was analogous to human muscle tissue. 10% calibrated gelatin is analogous to swine muscle, which is analogous to human muscle tissue. So that's where that standard, that's where that medium comes from. The FBI wanted at a minimum 12 inches up to a max of 18 inches. Why? Most people look at that and go, well, I'm not that thick. You're right. Most people are not going to be 12 inches, 18 inches thick front to rear. One of the things that occurred in Miami, and something that occurs in a number of law enforcement officer-involved shootings, is the bullet has to go through intermediate barriers. And then a classic example, if I've got a gun in my hands in front of my face shooting at you, and you've got a gun in your hand shooting at me, well, it's quite likely that my bullets and your bullets, to get in deep enough to damage vital structures, are going to have to go through forearms. In the case of the FBI incident, the bullet went through a bicep into the chest cavity and didn't quite go deep enough to sever the aorta. So these measurements, these depths, may seem a little deep when you look at the body in isolation, but understand that the rounds have got to penetrate deep enough to damage vital structures, regardless of angle and regardless of intermediate barriers. The FBI standards were done in '89. Fast forward a couple of years, 1996, the IWBA, the International Wound Ballistics Association, came up with sort of a revised standard. The IWBA, the International Wound Ballistics Association, is now defunct, but they were heavily involved in the original FBI, developing the original FBI protocols, and again in '96 came up with a streamlined version. The FBI protocols had 8 stages, so it was relatively expensive and relatively time-consuming to do all of the testing for any given caliber or any given round of ammunition in the FBI protocol. The IWBA protocol pared that down to 2 tests. So they had only 2 stages. It took less materials, less time. It was all around a more compressed version of the test. They also tightened up the standards. The IWBA test, one round is done in bare gelatin, one round is done in a 4-layer denim test. In bare gelatin, they want greater than 12.5 inches and no more than 14 inches of penetration. And through the 4-layer denim test, they want greater than 13 and no greater than 16. By locking in a minimum and maximum performance, it allowed them, or allowed ammunition designers, to tweak their given rounds to maximize performance. So most of your ammunition today is produced to one of those standards. I'll try and upload or try and include some photographs with this video showing depth, showing penetration tests in gelatin, where you can see 9mm, 40, 45, 57 SIG all punch into more or less the same depth. That's what they're designed to do. Now, obviously, all things being equal, a bigger bullet is better. A bigger bullet that expands and gets bigger is going to make a bigger hole. It's going to contact more tissue. That's certainly not a bad thing. But understand that all of your major ammunition, all your major duty or defensive ammunition are designed to this standard. Given that, the huge differences between, the huge perceived differences between 9mm and 45 or 40 and 9 or whatever, they're just at their perception. They're not accurate. One of the things I've got listed here is ammo and gun equals time in fight. Ammo and gun, what I mean here is the more ammunition you have in the pistol, the longer you can stay in the fight, the longer you can focus on working sights and trigger before you have to take the gun apart and put the gun back together. If you've got a 7-shot gun versus a 17-shot gun, you can look at the sight and work the trigger 7 times, and then you've got to take the gun apart, you've got to unload it, reload it, etc., to get back on to the shooting. If the gun's got 17 rounds in it, well, you've obviously got more time in that fight before you start messing with your gear. To my mind, that is a very useful, very important thing. All right, now, about this time, I'm sure some of the guys that are big 45 fans are going on about, remember during the Philippines, the Philippine insurrection, the Moros, blah, 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 blah. If you're not familiar with that story, the story is the U.S. military were being issued 38 revolvers during the time of the Philippine insurrection. The Moros, some of the natives of the Philippines that were very dedicated to not having white people around, they were soaking up 38 after 38 after 38 and still cutting down American service members. And so the old .45 single action revolver was pulled out of stores and was issued because it was going to be more reliable than the .38. And that's sort of where that story ends, if you're a .45 guy. The rest of that story is the .45 Colt revolver was no more effective than a .38 at stopping the Moros. And there were a number of reports of Moros sucking up multiple rounds of .38-40 Krag, which was our rifle at the time, and continuing to fight and continuing to kill American service members. So again, pistols do a lousy job of stopping people that don't want to be stopped. When it comes to looking at modern duty or defensive ammunition, as a general rule, the heavier bullet in a given caliber is going to offer more consistent penetration and more consistent performance than a lighter bullet. In .45, that translates to a 230 grain bullet. In .40 cal, that translates to a 180 grain bullet. In 9mm, that translates to a 147 grain bullet. Now, there are exceptions, and there's no hard and fast rules as far as that goes. What we're looking at is the performance in standardized testing, the performance in the IBBA test protocols or the FBI test protocols. There are lighter rounds in every given caliber that meet those standards. And as long as they meet those standards, I'm cool with that. Personally, I carry high capacity 9mm with 147 grain hollow point. Now, whether that's the old Winchester Ranger or currently the Federal HST, I don't care. As long as the round is manufactured by a reputable company, it's got good quality control, and the rounds perform acceptably in the IBBA test protocols, then I'm cool with that.